Welcome again to another evening at the Center for the Pacific Rim. Very lucky this evening, even warm as it is. I've opened the windows on your left. Hopefully you'll get a cross breeze. If not, I'll have someone stand out front and wave. We're very happy to welcome Professor, Dr., famous public intellectual Francis Fukuyama this evening to an event in which we will get a lot of inside information and a look at his new book, a big book, 600 pages. I had sworn never to read a 600-page book as I got younger and younger. So it's usually 200 pages and I turn it back over to the bookstore. But this intrigued me, and many an early morning I have been sitting up with Frank in a very different kind of way, reading this wonderful, wonderful book. What we have in front of us is a student of one of the great professors in the Department of Government at Harvard. His name lives on in many magisterial works. His name was Sam Huntington. He worked also in the nation's capital, advising presidents. And following in his footsteps, many of his students have done the same, particularly the student who is now sitting here visiting us from Stanford. The gentleman gave us a look at his way of thinking by writing a rather famous book. In short, it's known as The End of History. And we will get to that at the end of the talk, so that we don't spend all of the time about what that perhaps means and why the controversy and the many, many meetings were held about that book. So we have a gentleman who came down from Harvard and found the nation's capital waiting. Lots of people do that. They actually, unfortunately, drink the water there, and there's a disease that's carried in the river Potomac. It's called Potomac Fever. And once you catch that, you never leave Washington, D.C. But this gentleman broke with that tradition after a stint that took him to Johns Hopkins SAIS, which is a magnificent boutique graduate university in the nation's capital. And now, as I say, he's visiting here on a permanent basis, I hope, at Stanford University. So now I will sit down without falling down. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Patrick. How are you?
I'm fine. We want to test these mics to make sure they work. This wonderful, wonderful book starts out, I think, with a tribe in New Guinea. And he, our author, asks a famous question like, well, the Australians and the British gave them their freedom with all of the things that come with the Anglo-Saxon world, parliaments, law courts, etc. And yet they seem to stay entranced with a tribal organization, and the big man is the man you go to solve problems. But we could never understand that, we who believed in modernization theory. We thought we could step forward and backwards and bring the rest of the world out of its cocoon. Why doesn't that work, Frank?
Well, that was a question I started with because I had been spending a lot of the time since September 11th working on these failed states like Afghanistan and Iraq, where in American foreign policy, we're constantly being disappointed because we want to create stable, modern, democratic polities in places like Afghanistan and find it tremendously difficult. And I think the reason is basically that it is difficult, and we've simply forgotten how difficult that process was in the West and in China and in other places where we can take the state for granted. So in this country, we've got this tremendous luxury where we can afford to be very anti-status. And we can complain about the government gets in the way all the time, it's only an obstacle to private initiative and so forth. And I think we fail to recognize what it means actually to live in a place like Somalia or Afghanistan where you actually don't have a government. And you got a lot of private initiative, with guys carrying AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. But to actually have durable institutions, a state that can actually enforce laws, a rule of law that can constrain that state, and then some form of democratic accountability is a process that in the West took well over 1,000 years. And so why anyone thinks that this is something that can happen in a short period of time in a developing country, I think is actually, the burden ought to be on that person.
One of the interesting things about this book, if you read it, is that you start way back. Then you recognize this book is only volume 1. There's a second volume coming. And this book will only take you up until that crazy time when the French decided to invent a machine that cut off heads, and we had the guillotine and the French Revolution, and then you'll have no more of this book because the second volume will take you forward. So what's amazing about it, particularly for people like me who studied at old-fashioned places like Berkeley, we always thought that if you wanted to look at the rise of the state, of a polity, of a group that form all the institutional frameworks, you really only had to go back to that famous The Rise of the West. And this book starts as, no, it went back much further, and it's not in the West, it's in the East. So for a political state to exist, the first one our scholar could find was China, and the first he could find where there was rule of law was India. And so you have the Qin Dynasty, and you have it with a real sense that this man has looked back at the Chinese experience. Before the Qin rose to conquer the other remaining states, China went through 500 years of war, the warring states period. Before that, they'd had a small collection of dynasties we won't go into. But this enormously powerful French state took over and finally conquered all the others and gave us the first state. Is that right?
That's correct, but the book goes a lot further back in history than that, because I think you have to understand what do we mean by a state. And the Qin Dynasty in China, 221 BC, when it conquered the whole of China and established a single entity there, that was not the first state in the world, because you had a state in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Valley of Mexico, a lot of other places. What you had there was really, I believe, the first modern state, meaning it was the first state in which you get beyond basically recruiting your friends and your family to run the institution, and instead they developed a civil service examination, impersonal administration, recruitment, taxation, bureaucracies, and all of this was in place in the 3rd century BC. Now, this may not seem like such an accomplishment, but that's why actually in the book I go much further back than that, all the way back to chimpanzee behavior and other kinds of primates, because in a sense, you can't understand what an achievement that is to create a modern state unless you understand a certain fact about human biology, which is that human beings are naturally social. We don't have to learn how to interact with one another. The biologists have 2 basic principles. One is the principle of kin selection, which means we are altruistic towards genetic relatives. In other words, it's a principle of nepotism. And the other principle is the principle of reciprocal altruism, where you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And you can see this kind of behavior not just among primates, but many other animal species behave in this fashion. So you don't even have to be a human being to be social in this particular fashion. And all human societies up to this moment are basically based on friends and family. That's the default mode of human sociability. And you cannot get to this creation, the modern state, in which you're not dealing with friends and family, but people on a much more impersonal basis, really until you get to China. And that's why I single China out, because it takes the Europeans another 1,800 years until they create a kind of modern, bureaucratic, rational, centralized, impersonal administration, all of which was really in place in China at this very early point. And I frankly think they honestly have not gotten credit for this, what I think was a really major historical achievement.
So we have the Qin Dynasty's great achievement in these sometimes called scholar bureaucrats, the great mandarins, and the great sense of an exam and a meritocracy that goes up and down depending on the dynasties. But you do tell us in the book that to do that, the Qin, which was a short-lived dynasty, had to ruthlessly try and put down a kind of tribalism through kinship, which seemed to be included in Confucian thinking. So there was a legalist view of a strong state in which the emperor, using his scholar bureaucrats, controlled all, and coming from the bottom or the center of the state was this very long ethical code tied up with Confucianism. And so you have that push and pull in your book on a constant basis, trying to live with both. But the Qin go very quickly, as some of you know, because all of you are going to see the Terracotta Warriors in Xi'an. And then comes a dynamic dynasty in two phases, early Han and late Han, in which they are able to work with both. So they do not give up the idea in China of a strong and powerful state with these scholar bureaucrats, but they also allow the Confucian mode to still exist in a kind of bifurcation of a society that wants this. And every so often you see a upsurge over the thousands of years of Chinese history of the force of the family, and then the upsurge again of the force of the state, living in a kind of tension. And that's a wonderful way to look at a meritocracy in the making BC. At the same time, then you jump across those great mountains, the Himalayas, and you land in the land of the Indian towns and villages, and there you pose another interesting question, that for Indian civilization, you have to look very carefully to understand that the warrior class did not come out on top, that a priest-driven, priest-led class did. And this, therefore, allowed a great deal of power to remain scattered about in the Indian areas and never to see really a strong state on the order of the Qin. But because of this dispersal, you saw the beginnings of law. Am I paraphrasing you, William?
No, that's absolutely right. What the law is, in my view, or the rule of law, is, there's as many definitions as you have law school professors, but the one I'm using in this book is the following, that the law is a set of rules reflecting the moral consensus of a community, but it isn't the rule of law unless it's binding on the rulers, on the top, the king, the Raja, the monarch, the president, the prime minister. And if you ask yourself, well, where does the rule of law come from in any society? It almost always comes out of religion historically. And the Indians, if there's one thing they're good at, it is religious creativity. And so it's very interesting because the Indians and the Chinese start out as a tribal people, and in about let's say the year 1000 BC, they eat cattle, they're pastoral nomads, they settle down. The Chinese develop this powerful state. The Indians develop a very powerful religion in which the Brahmin class, there's a fourfold division of humanity. So the Brahmins are the priestly class, and they put themselves at the top of Indian society. The Kshatriyas are the warriors. They are definitely second-class citizens. The Shudras are the Shudras are the people at the bottom, and there is a third Varna in there which represents the merchants. So the top three Varnas are basically, the top maybe 10-15% of Indian society. But the main thing is that the warriors do not rule in India. A warrior, to get crowned Raja, has to go to a Brahmin. And in fact, every ceremony in life requires going to the Brahmin in your village to get religious sanction. And that's something that simply doesn't exist in China because there's no transcendental religion. And so to this day, the Chinese have never had